August 14th, 1983. Inside a dim, smoke-filled operations room deep in a Soviet naval facility near Vladivostok, 3 senior advisors crowded around a radar replay console. The air smelled of stale tobacco and hot electronics. On the wall behind them, charts of the East China Sea were pinned with red markers, showing patrol routes flown by their Chinese allies. To these men, the MiG fighters on those charts were symbols of a doctrine they believed the West could never outrun. Colonel Viktor Sidorov leaned back in his chair, smirking as a grainy projection of an American F-14 Tomcat appeared. He tapped the silhouette with a wooden pointer. "There it is, the flying museum piece," he said. "Too heavy, too wide. It cannot turn with a proper fighter. The Chinese boys will handle it easily." Another advisor exhaled a slow ribbon of cigarette smoke. "Our MiGs were built for this exact engagement profile," he said with total confidence. "Point them at the American machine, force a hard turn, and it collapses under its own weight." The room chuckled. For years, the Soviet Union had coached China's Air Force in the art of short-range energy fighting. Quick climbs, sharp brake turns, and simple weapons, these were the pillars of their philosophy. Nothing about the oversized American fleet fighter fit their logic. To them, the F-14 was simply a large target, packed with expensive electronics that would fail the moment real combat pressure appeared. But the recording they were about to review would not follow Soviet logic. A technician rolled in a metal cart carrying a monitor unit. He inserted the tape, blue static flashed, then stabilized into a stark, cloudless sky. 2 F-14 seconds slicing across the frame in tight formation, just like photographs American pilots love to show off. Condensation trails curled behind their wings, shimmering like twin white blades. The Soviet advisors scoffed again. "Pretty picture," one muttered. "Let's see how it ends." The MiGs entered the frame a moment later, 2 fast-climbing shapes angling in with confidence. On paper, this was the perfect setup, 2 nimble interceptors cornering a bulky fleet defender. The Soviet advisors leaned forward, already anticipating the moment the Tomcat would be forced into a defensive spiral. But instead of turning, the F-14 held its line. The advisors frowned. That was not standard behavior for a pilot about to be overrun. The MiGs tightened their angle. The Tomcat still did not break. A thin electronic tone echoed from the tape's audio feed, barely audible, but unmistakable to anyone who had studied American systems. One advisor's smile faded. He recognized that tone. It was not the sound of a plane preparing to flee. It was the sound of a radar locking 2 targets at once. And before any of the men in that smoke-filled room could speak, the moment that would rewrite their assumptions forever was already in motion. The advisors watched the frozen radar frame with a confidence forged from years of doctrine, because to them, the Chinese MiGs represented the distilled essence of everything the Soviet Union believed about air combat, a philosophy built around small airframes, raw thrust, and pilots trained to strike with speed and aggression, rather than drown in complicated systems or elaborate Western tactics. They considered the MiG-21 and its Chinese derivatives to be the ultimate expression of simplicity and efficiency, a machine designed to climb fast, turn hard, and kill quickly, relying on minimal avionics and muscle memory, rather than elaborate sensors or layered decision loops. To these men, the MiGs were not just fighters, but ideological proof that the Soviet approach to warfare was superior, since a small, lightweight interceptor required almost no maintenance, consumed little fuel, and could be built in enormous numbers, giving any allied nation the power to challenge Western air forces without needing American industrial capacity or advanced training programs. They had spent years teaching Chinese pilots that victory came from seizing control of the vertical plane early, forcing the enemy into desperate defensive maneuvers, and maintaining energy through tight, disciplined turns that would eventually expose the opponent's weak point. The advisors genuinely believed this method could break even the most advanced American aircraft, because every simulation they had run showed that U.S. fighters, burdened by heavy avionics and complex radar suites, would eventually bleed too much speed during a sustained engagement and lose the ability to maneuver decisively. Their pride in this theory was visible in the way they gestured toward the MiGs on the radar display, tracing the expected interception arc with absolute certainty, convinced that the American F-14 had already committed a fatal mistake by refusing to break formation or initiate a defensive climb. They repeated familiar talking points about how the MiGs' instantaneous turn rate outmatched Western jets, how its lighter weight made it difficult to track on radar, and how a well-timed high G brake could force even experienced American pilots into a losing spiral that ended with an exhausted aircraft and a clean missile solution for the attacker. In their minds, the tiny jet streaking across the replay tape represented a battlefield scalpel, engineered to slice apart lumbering opponents like the twin-tailed Tomcat, which they viewed as a bloated symbol of American excess rather than a lethal piece of naval engineering. What they failed to notice, however, was how the very simplicity they admired now prevented the MiG pilots from understanding the threat they were flying into, because their limited sensors and outdated warning receivers offered almost no information about the F-14's evolving radar picture, leaving them blind to the fact that the Tomcat was not retreating, but quietly gathering, firing data with a system far beyond anything the MiG's designers had imagined. The Soviet advisors, still certain their doctrine would be vindicated, leaned closer to the screen with a sense of eager anticipation, unaware that the next seconds would expose the fatal weakness baked into the elegant but outdated weapon they had spent their careers praising. For decades, Soviet instructors had assured their allies that air combat was ultimately a contest of discipline and geometry, where the pilot who mastered energy management and turn performance would always prevail against an opponent burdened by unnecessary complexity, and this conviction became the backbone of Chinese training programs that emphasized sharp brake turns, rapid vertical transitions, and decisive close-range engagement sequences. They taught that superior maneuverability could compensate for inferior sensors, insisting that a nimble interceptor guided by aggressive doctrine would outfight even the most technologically advanced Western aircraft if the pilot simply forced the engagement into the right envelope. This belief was reinforced by thousands of training flights, in which MiG derivatives repeatedly outturned older American jets in controlled scenarios, creating an illusion of dominance that hardened into an unshakable assumption within Soviet and Chinese tactical circles. As the advisors watched the radar replay, they recited these principles to one another with quiet certainty, tracing imaginary arcs across the screen and predicting where the MiGs would force the F-14 to bleed energy before committing to a final hard turn that would seal the American pilot's fate. They believed the Tomcat's complex systems made it inherently fragile under pressure, because any aircraft carrying that much electronics and fuel was expected to struggle once it entered a turning battle against smaller adversaries. In their minds, the F-14's pilot would eventually be forced to abandon his formation, dump altitude, or execute an emergency climb that would telegraph his weakness and allow the MiGs to close for an easy missile shot. However, this confidence masked a widening doctrinal gap the advisors refused to acknowledge, because their entire framework for understanding air combat had been shaped by Cold War assumptions that no longer applied to the rapidly evolving Western concept of beyond visual range dominance. While Soviet doctrine still centered on close-quarters maneuvering and brute pilot skill, American strategy had pivoted toward longer engagement loops, sensor fusion, and weapons that enabled decisive kills before opponents could even recognize the threat. The advisors continued praising the MiG's ability to turn inside an American jet, yet they never considered that modern conflict might reward the aircraft that controlled information rather than the aircraft that executed the tightest radius turn. This blind spot was amplified by their distrust of complex technology, which they saw as an unreliable crutch rather than a combat advantage, leading them to underestimate the sheer magnitude of the F-14's AWG-9 radar and its ability to track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges far beyond what the MiG's older systems could perceive. They failed to understand that the Tomcat was designed not to win a turning fight, but to avoid one entirely, striking with precision from distances where maneuverability offered almost no protection. As they leaned closer to the radar console, still convinced the MiGs were about to force the F-14 into submission, they remained unaware that the battle they imagined an elegant duel of turns, energy, and pilot reflexes had already been rendered irrelevant by a new era of air power defined by sensors, timing, and lethality beyond anything their doctrine had prepared them to confront. The Soviet advisors shifted in their seats as the radar replay advanced, each man quietly reaffirming the conclusion he had drawn long before this incident, namely that the American F-14 Tomcat, despite its imposing appearance, remained a fundamentally flawed machine built on excess rather than combat necessity, a tool shaped more by American industrial pride than by the brutal realities of aerial warfare. They believed the aircraft's massive wingspan, heavy avionics suite, and sophisticated variable geometry system created a pilot workload so demanding that no one could fully exploit its theoretical performance without being overwhelmed by cascading tasks during real combat. Their assessments, repeated for years in training materials and intelligence briefings, described the Tomcat as a platform that looked formidable during demonstrations, yet faltered whenever forced to execute rapid, high-stress maneuvering against smaller, more agile foes. As they watched the MiGs continue closing on the replay, they muttered familiar criticisms about the Tomcat's weight and fuel consumption, insisting that any fighter requiring such large engines to remain airworthy would naturally bleed speed faster than opponents designed with minimalist engineering principles. One advisor pointed at the display and explained, with unwavering certainty, that the F-14's radar system consumed so much power and processing time that its pilot would inevitably struggle to maintain situational awareness once engaged from multiple vectors. Another chimed in, arguing that the aircraft's swing-wing configuration introduced mechanical vulnerabilities that might delay response times in high-G environments, thereby creating exploitable windows for MiG pilots trained to strike without hesitation. They spoke with the confidence of men who had seen countless charts comparing thrust to weight ratios, instantaneous turn rates, and fuel endurance numbers, all of which appeared to favor the smaller MiG designs they had helped refine and export. These charts reinforced their conviction that the Tomcat's sophistication was a liability rather than a strength, because in their worldview complexity inevitably meant fragility, and fragility inevitably meant defeat when exposed to the unforgiving stress of aerial combat. They believed that American engineers had fallen in love with their own technology, building an aircraft so overloaded with sensors and computer-driven systems that it could not possibly match the raw, instinctive precision of a well-flown interceptor, relying on little more than pilot skill and aerodynamic efficiency. Yet, their threat assessment ignored the evolving nature of modern air engagements, particularly the shift toward battles, decided long before the aircraft ever entered visual range, where information dominance mattered more than pure maneuverability. They continued dismissing the Tomcat's AWG-9 radar as an over-engineered luxury, failing to grasp that its tracking power allowed the F-14 to shape the engagement before the MiGs even knew they were targeted. They remained convinced that radar complexity equated to operational weakness, unaware that the very features they criticized were quietly transforming the fight into a contest the MiGs were never equipped to survive. As they leaned closer to the replay, still reciting outdated metrics and rehearsing doctrinal talking points, none of them understood that the Tomcat's true danger lay not in how it turned, but in how it saw, because the moment it acquired those two approaching MiGs, the outcome was already sealed long before either pilot could react or execute the maneuvers the advisors so proudly championed. The radar replay shifted to a cleaner image, revealing the moment when the American fighters first sliced into the frame, their twin tails catching the sun and casting razor-sharp silhouettes across the flawless blue sky that stretched above the patrol zone like an enormous sheet of glass. Even in the grainy footage, the advisors could see the distinct geometry of the aircraft, with its wings swept partially forward and the fuselage appearing surprisingly sleek despite its size, giving the Tomcat a presence that felt more like a controlled missile than a lumbering interceptor. The feed stabilized long enough to show two F-14 seconds flying in impossibly tight formation, their condensation trails curling upward in symmetrical arcs that suggested perfect coordination, rather than the clumsy maneuvering the Soviets always associated with heavy American fighters. The advisors stared with a mixture of annoyance and reluctant curiosity, because the tape showed a level of composure that contradicted every technical assessment they had previously endorsed, particularly regarding the supposed difficulty of maintaining formation integrity in such a large aircraft during high-speed operations. They attempted to rationalize the sight by claiming the Tomcats must have been cruising slowly or preparing for a defensive turn, unaware that the aircraft were already operating at an energy state far above what the MiGs could comfortably match without compromising their climb efficiency. One advisor leaned closer, noting the faint glint along the F-14's nose, yet dismissing it as sunlight rather than acknowledging the possibility that the AWG-9 radar had already begun gathering data with a precision that their doctrine failed to comprehend. As the tape continued, the fighters seemed to glide rather than maneuver, maintaining a steady line across the horizon that made the approaching MiGs look almost frantic by comparison, their angular silhouettes darting upward in a series of small corrections that betrayed the pilot's efforts to maintain optimal intercept geometry. The advisors misread this contrast completely, interpreting the Tomcat's calm posture as evidence of hesitation, rather than the deliberate tactical control exercised by crews trained to win engagements long before an enemy aircraft could ever force a close-range duel. They murmured among themselves, insisting that any American pilot refusing to break formation under such circumstances must be inexperienced or unaware of the danger, because no one trained under Soviet doctrine would ever maintain a straight vector when facing an aggressive two-ship intercept from below. The replay zoomed again, showing the condensation streaming from the Tomcat's wings as it adjusted minutely to maintain its position against the wind, a subtle movement so controlled that it suggested an aircraft operating well within its performance envelope, rather than straining to compensate for excessive weight or drag. The advisors completely misinterpreted this stability, assuming it signaled a lack of readiness, or even a communication delay between the two American pilots, when in reality both F-14 crews were simply buying time while the radar system refined its firing solution. They continued discussing the MiG's superior turn rate and faster climb characteristics, unaware that none of those attributes would matter once the Tomcat decided to engage from a distance that eliminated maneuverability as a meaningful defensive factor. By the time the MiGs closed to their intended attack position, the Tomcats still appeared almost serene on the screen, maintaining the same unwavering line they had held from the moment the recording began, a posture that should have alarmed anyone familiar with Western engagement tactics. Yet the advisors clung tightly to their assumptions, convinced that the American pilots were either overconfident or inexperienced, never suspecting that the quiet, steady vector displayed on the radar was not a sign of weakness, but the unmistakable outline of a trap being sprung with chilling precision. The radar replay advanced again, capturing the instant the two Chinese MiGs committed fully to their intercept vector, their nose cones tilting upward with sharp, aggressive precision that reflected years of training built around the idea that seizing initiative early would always provide a decisive advantage in close combat encounters. The advisors watched with growing satisfaction as the MiGs accelerated into the engagement corridor, confident that the fighters were entering the optimal envelope, where speed, angle, and altitude would combine to pressure the American formation into a defensive break. They interpreted the MiGs' upward surge as a flawless execution of doctrine, believing the pilots were about to force the Tomcats to abandon their straight trajectory and lose the energy advantage required for any meaningful counterattack. On the tape, the MiGs appeared restless and energized, their silhouettes vibrating slightly as they surged through pockets of warmer air, giving the impression of aircraft eager to close the distance and force the Americans into a fight they supposedly could not win. The advisors praised the pilots' aggressiveness, remarking that such assertive maneuvering demonstrated a clear understanding of the engagement geometry and reflected the disciplined instincts drilled into them by Soviet instructors. They were certain the MiGs were moments away from slipping into positions that would overwhelm the Tomcats with superior turn rate and instantaneous control authority, eventually pinning the American aircraft into a predictable escape vector. What they failed to appreciate was the crucial asymmetry already unfolding, because the Tomcats showed none of the frantic corrections or energy fluctuations visible in the MiGs' approach, maintaining an eerily stable profile that suggested complete confidence rather than the vulnerability the advisors assumed. The F-14 seconds still held their formation, their wings slicing forward with effortless precision, and the radar feed showed no signs of the typical micro-adjustments pilots made when preparing for evasive maneuvers. Instead, the Tomcats seemed to glide steadily through the sky, their deliberate posture indicating that their pilots were not only calm, but already executing the engagement timeline required for a beyond visual range strike. The advisors continued misreading every detail, interpreting the Tomcats' silence as hesitation rather than discipline, and treating the MiGs' increasing speed as proof that the Chinese pilots were gaining control of the situation. They failed to understand that the very aggressiveness they celebrated was now pushing the MiGs deeper into a radar cone from which they could not easily escape, because each tightening approach angle reduced the pilot's ability to disengage or execute a safe defensive maneuver once the Tomcats decided to act. The advisors, consumed by their own expectations, believed the MiGs were on the verge of outmaneuvering the Americans, unaware that they had already entered a kill zone where maneuverability was meaningless. As the distance between the aircraft closed further, The MiGs initiated a shallow, preemptive turn, designed to force the Tomcats into reactive movement. But the American fighters remained perfectly aligned, betraying no signs of pressure or uncertainty. This unmoving posture unsettled one of the younger advisors, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair and asked whether the Americans might be preparing something unexpected, but his comment was dismissed immediately by colleagues who insisted the Tomcats were merely delaying a doomed defensive break. Yet the replay showed the opposite, because the F-14's second stability indicated not confusion, but preparation, as though the aircraft were drawing the MiGs toward an invisible threshold, one beyond which the engagement would no longer belong to the pilots, relying solely on agility and instinct, but to those controlling the battle space with sensors and timing that far exceeded anything the advisors had prepared their allies to confront. The Soviet advisors leaned closer as the MiGs tightened their intercept angle, fully convinced they were witnessing the precise moment when their doctrine would force the American pilots into a disadvantageous reaction. Yet they failed to recognize that the Tomcats' unmoving flight path was not a sign of hesitation, but the unmistakable signature of pilots preparing to exploit a sensor advantage their allies could neither detect nor understand. They interpreted the Tomcats' smooth, deliberate vector as evidence that the Americans were slow to process the threat, assuming the pilots were overwhelmed by the rapidly closing geometry and unsure which MiG posed the greater danger. What they did not realize was that the F-14 crews were intentionally maintaining a steady trajectory to allow the WWII radar to complete its multi-target firing solution, a process that required consistent alignment and stable closure rates, conditions the MiGs themselves were unknowingly perfecting with each aggressive advance. The advisors continued praising the MiGs' assertive climb, convinced the fighters were about to cut inside the Tomcats' engagement circle and force a high-G defensive maneuver, but the feed showed something far more ominous. The American jets made only the smallest micro-adjustments, subtle shifts that indicated the radar had already locked both incoming aircraft and was now calculating the optimal launch envelope for a simultaneous attack. One advisor pointed at the faint glimmer beneath the Tomcat's nose and dismissed it as nothing more than a reflection, insisting that such visual artifacts were common in low-quality recordings, unaware that he was staring directly at the first physical indicator of a radar antenna fully committed to a dual-target track. Their confidence grew as the MiGs continued closing the distance, but that confidence rested on a disastrous assumption that the Tomcats could not fire effectively until the MiGs entered visual range and triggered a traditional maneuvering battle, the very scenario Soviet doctrine insisted American fighters were ill-equipped to survive. This assumption blinded them to the fact that the MiGs were now deep inside a kill zone, shaped not by turn rates or pilot reflexes, but by the Tomcats' advanced ability to engage multiple targets at long distances, an ability the advisors had repeatedly dismissed as impractical during real combat. As the distance between the aircraft shrank, the MiGs attempted a coordinated tightening maneuver designed to force the Tomcats to break formation, but instead of reacting, the American fighters displayed a cold, almost predatory stillness that one younger advisor found unsettling enough to question, though his hesitation was swiftly silenced by senior officers who remained chained to their outdated expectations. The replay revealed the MiGs crossing the final threshold that made disengagement nearly impossible, their angles now too steep and their closure too fast to allow a safe retreat. Yet the advisors continued interpreting this as tactical dominance rather than a catastrophic overcommitment. They completely overlooked how the radar cone enveloping the MiGs had narrowed to its optimal strike window, providing the Tomcat crew with precise data on speed, aspect, and altitude, information that would allow a missile launch with almost no reaction time for the Chinese pilots. By the time the first advisor noticed an unusual stability in the Tomcat's wings, an unnatural stillness that suggested imminent action rather than defensive delay, the trap had already closed, sealing the MiGs' fate long before anyone in the smoke-filled room realized that the battle they believed was just beginning had already been decided by a miscalculation that their doctrine had never prepared them to recognize. The Soviet advisors watched the replay with growing anticipation, still convinced the MiGs were moments away from forcing the Tomcats into a desperate defensive maneuver, yet the tape showed a far different reality, unfolding in the sky above the ocean, where the American fighters maintained a chilling steadiness that signaled readiness rather than fear. As the MiGs crossed the final segment of their intercept arc, the Tomcat's radar signature brightened imperceptibly on the tracking display, a subtle shift that signified the AWG-9's firing solution had fully matured, though none of the observers in the operations room recognized its meaning. They continued discussing the MiG's superior turn radius, oblivious to the fact that the American pilots were not preparing to evade, but to strike with a precision that rendered maneuverability irrelevant. Then, almost too quickly for the eye to register, the first missile detached from the Tomcat's belly rail, leaving a thin spear of exhaust that blossomed into a white trail, before accelerating toward the nearest MiG with frightening efficiency. The advisors reacted with surprise, insisting the launch must have been premature or poorly calculated, because their doctrine claimed such long-range shots rarely succeeded under real combat conditions. Even as they argued, the missile closed the distance faster than the MiG pilots could adjust, and the replay showed the faint, grainy burst of light that marked the fighter's destruction, a silent flash that erased one aircraft entirely from the engagement in less than a second. The room fell quiet, but only for a moment, because the tape advanced again and revealed the Tomcat had already fired a second missile, its trajectory arcing slightly before curving inward toward the surviving MiG, which attempted a hurried defensive break that came too late to disrupt the missile's guidance. The advisors stared in disbelief as the second explosion flickered across the screen. Another brief flash swallowed almost instantly by static and smoke, leaving the radar display with a single fading echo, where two confident attackers had been only seconds earlier. Their earlier commentary about turn rate and climb superiority now hung in the air like a hollow incantation, completely detached from the reality unfolding on the screen. For the first time since the replay began, none of the advisors spoke, because the speed of the engagement contradicted everything they had taught their Chinese counterparts, revealing a battlefield dominated not by agility or instinct, but by sensors capable of shaping the fight before the enemy even understood the danger. One officer rewound the footage, insisting there must be an error, yet each viewing only made the sequence feel more surreal, as if the laws of aerial combat had been rewritten in the space of a few heartbeats. The MiG's aggressive approach, once praised as doctrinal perfection, now appeared hopelessly naive, a reckless dive into an invisible range from which no amount of maneuverability could provide an escape. By the time the replay returned to its original timestamp, the advisors could no longer deny what had happened, because the entire engagement from the first radar lock to the final explosion had taken place in a span of barely 25 seconds, a duration so brief that human reflexes offered no meaningful input once the Tomcat committed to the strike. They sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty patches of sky on the radar display, slowly realizing that the aircraft they had mocked as bloated and over-engineered had executed a perfect dual kill, with a level of precision their doctrine could neither predict nor counter. And in that moment, the laughter that once filled the room was replaced by a heavy, unspoken understanding that the air war they thought they understood had evolved beyond the reach of everything they had spent their careers teaching. The silence that settled over the Soviet operations room did not resemble the thoughtful quiet of analysts reviewing complex data, but rather the stunned, breathless stillness of men confronting a reality they had never believed possible, one that contradicted not only their expectations for the engagement, but the foundational assumptions of their entire air combat doctrine. Several advisors continued staring at the replay's final frames, hoping to find some technical error or misinterpreted signal that could explain how two confident MiG pilots were erased in less time than it took to complete a basic radio check, yet each repeated viewing only deepened the sense of disbelief that now weighed heavily across the room. Their faces, once animated with pride and certainty, now reflected a mixture of confusion and quiet dread, as though the destruction of those two fighters had revealed a chasm beneath their feet they had never imagined existed. One advisor finally broke the silence by suggesting that the MiGs must have suffered catastrophic mechanical failures, an explanation rooted more in desperation than logic, because nothing in the recording supported such a theory, and the idea collapsed under even the most generous scrutiny. Another insisted the tape might have been edited, claiming the Americans were known for their propaganda theatrics, yet he lacked the conviction his own accusation required, and his colleagues dismissed the comment with tired, uncertain gestures. The truth was unavoidable. The F-14 had executed its attack with flawless precision, and the MiG pilots, despite their aggressive approach and deep training, had never stood a chance. As the realization settled in, several advisors attempted to articulate the magnitude of what they had witnessed, pointing out that the Tomcat's performance directly contradicted years of intelligence assessments that described its radar as overly complex, its missile systems as unreliable in real combat, and its pilots as too dependent on electronic aids to respond effectively under pressure. These judgments, once repeated with unwavering confidence, now felt embarrassingly outdated, relics of a worldview that had failed to keep pace with the rapidly shifting landscape of Western aerial warfare. For the first time, the advisors were forced to question whether their own doctrine, rooted in maneuverability, simplicity, and mass-produced efficiency, could survive encounters where information dominance and long-range precision mattered far more than turn rates or instantaneous control authority. The younger officers, less anchored to older assumptions, were the first to recognize the deeper implications, whispering to one another about how the MiGs' aggressive intercept had played directly into the Tomcats' strengths rather than exposing their weaknesses, effectively turning what should have been a high-energy dogfight into a one-sided execution shaped entirely by radar geometry. They understood that if a single F-14 could eliminate two attackers so quickly and with such cold control, then entire squadrons, equipped with similar systems, could reshape the balance of power across any theater where early detection and long-range engagement defined the battlespace. Even the senior advisors began to sense the scale of the threat, though they remained outwardly defiant, insisting that the engagement must have been a fluke, a fortunate alignment of variables unlikely to repeat under different circumstances. Yet their voices lacked authority, and the arguments felt hollow, because deep inside they recognized that the tape had not shown an accident, but a blueprint, a demonstration of a new kind of air dominance that their doctrine had not anticipated and their aircraft could not counter. And as the radar display finally faded into static, each man understood, in the quiet place behind his thoughts, that the world they believed they controlled had shifted decisively in the span of 25 impossible seconds. Once the initial shock began to fade, the Soviet advisors finally shifted into the analytical mode that had defined their careers, replaying the engagement frame by frame as they attempted to understand how an aircraft they had dismissed for years could dismantle two interceptors with such unnerving efficiency. They pulled out notebooks filled with radar signatures, missile performance charts, and tactical diagrams, hoping to identify some unconventional variable that might explain the Tomcats' effectiveness. Yet every technical detail they examined only reinforced the uncomfortable truth that modern air combat had evolved beyond the parameters their doctrine considered meaningful. One advisor noted how the WWII radar maintained a stable multi-target track even while the Tomcat held formation, a feat their own systems struggled to replicate under anything more demanding than controlled testing conditions. They reviewed the MiGs' approach vector repeatedly, mapping the angles and closure rates with meticulous care, but the data revealed another uncomfortable insight. The MiGs' aggressive climb had not forced the Tomcat into a defensive posture, but had instead funneled both fighters deeper into the radar cone, where the American aircraft enjoyed complete situational dominance. The advisors measured the distance at the moment of the first missile launch, and were disturbed to find it fell squarely within the WWII's optimal firing envelope, meaning the Tomcat crew had likely been preparing the shot long before the MiGs even registered their presence on older, less capable sensors. This realization struck at the heart of their assumptions, because it showed that the MiGs had never controlled the engagement, even though their aggressive maneuvers had initially made it appear otherwise. As they examined the missile trajectories, another pattern emerged that further undermined their doctrine. The Tomcats' weapons did not rely on the traditional close-range guidance profiles the advisors were accustomed to evaluating, but instead exploited long-range seeker logic that allowed the missiles to adjust mid-flight with chilling precision, compensating for evasive maneuvers. The MiGs attempted only after it was far too late to matter. The advisors traced the curved paths of the missiles on the display, realizing that the weapons had effectively erased the maneuverability advantage the MiGs were supposed to possess, turning the engagement into a controlled sequence dictated entirely by sensor timing and reaction lag, rather than raw aerodynamic performance. They paused the replay at the moment the second MiG attempted its last-second defensive break, watching how the missile arced cleanly to intercept the new vector without hesitation, demonstrating a level of guidance sophistication that none of their early-generation systems could replicate. One advisor quietly admitted that the Tomcat had displayed not only superior radar integration, but also superior energy management, because the aircraft's steady flight path indicated it retained ample speed and altitude even after committing to the launches, something their reports had claimed was impossible given the fighter's weight. This single detail shattered one of their longest-held beliefs. that an American aircraft burdened with complex systems would always trade away its mobility in exchange for situational awareness. By the time they completed their reconstruction, the advisors realized that the Tomcat had never been forced into a reactive stance at any point during the engagement, meaning the MiGs had not merely been defeated, they had been outclassed before the fight even began. Each technical layer they uncovered revealed another flaw in their previous assessments, and every new insight pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The Americans had mastered a form of air combat where information, timing, and precision mattered far more than the maneuverability metrics they had spent their lives perfecting. And as the advisors stared at the final compiled diagram, a stark, undeniable thought settled over them. Nothing in their existing doctrine could bridge the technological gulf they had just witnessed unfold in the quiet, merciless geometry of the sky. In the hours that followed their exhaustive reconstruction, the Soviet advisors drafted a preliminary report intended for senior command. Yet the document's tone differed sharply from the confident assessments they were accustomed to producing, reflecting instead a reluctant acknowledgement that the engagement had exposed vulnerabilities far deeper than any of them were willing to admit aloud. They attempted to frame the incident as an anomaly, arguing that the MiG's failure stemmed from an unfortunate combination of timing and unfavorable geometry. But each time they rehearsed the explanation, it collapsed beneath the weight of the technical evidence they themselves had compiled. Their report, though outwardly measured, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of unease, signaling that the long-assumed dominance of Soviet-style intercept doctrine had been seriously, perhaps fatally, undermined. When the report reached Moscow, the reaction was immediate and severe, because senior officials recognized the geopolitical implications that extended far beyond a single failed intercept. If the Americans possessed a platform capable of reliably executing dual long-range kills against highly maneuverable adversaries, then entire regions, particularly those reliant on Soviet-designed aircraft, could suddenly find their airspace vulnerable in ways that previous strategic models had never contemplated. Analysts at higher echelons were forced to reconsider long-held assumptions regarding the balance of power in the Pacific, where the Chinese Air Force, trained extensively by Soviet advisors, represented a critical buffer against expanding American naval influence. In Beijing, the incident generated its own wave of alarm because Chinese commanders were stunned to learn how quickly their fighters had been eliminated and how little warning their pilots had received before the missiles arrived. They requested immediate clarification from the Soviet contingent, demanding to know whether the failure stemmed from pilot error, equipment limitations, or doctrinal shortcomings, yet no answer fully satisfied the growing fear that their air fleet had been rendered obsolete by a technology gap they had underestimated for too long. This pressure forced Soviet advisors to confront the uncomfortable reality that their doctrine, once exported with pride, now risked becoming a liability for their allies, who depended on it to counter American power projection across volatile regions. As discussions intensified, some senior Soviet officers argued for urgent upgrades to existing radar and missile systems, recommending increased funding for programs that had previously been dismissed as unnecessary or too resource-intensive. Others pushed for accelerated development of counter-tactics, specifically aimed at neutralizing long-range engagements, though such proposals offered little comfort given how thoroughly the Tomcat's AWG-9 system had controlled the encounter in the replay. Meanwhile, the intelligence community debated whether the Americans had refined similar capabilities across additional platforms, raising the possibility that the F-14's performance was not an isolated marvel, but a harbinger of a broader doctrinal shift toward sensor-driven air warfare. In Western intelligence circles, the incident had a very different impact, generating a quiet but palpable sense of validation because the Tomcat's flawless execution demonstrated the strategic value of investing in advanced detection and engagement systems, even when traditionalists criticized them as overly complex or impractical. Top Gun instructors immediately incorporated the event into their internal lectures, using it as a case study to emphasize the importance of controlling engagement range and maintaining situational awareness through high-fidelity sensors. They recognized that the engagement represented more than a tactical success. It signaled a transformation in aerial warfare that favored platforms capable of shaping the fight before the enemy ever understood it had begun. By the time the dust settled, the 25-second destruction of the two MiGs had triggered a cascade of reassessments, debates, and doctrinal revisions across both Soviet and Chinese command structures, leaving even the most confident advisors questioning whether their long-cherished principles could survive in a world increasingly dominated by aircraft, designed to win wars through information, precision, and timing rather than brute maneuverability. In the end, the consequences rippled far beyond the confines of that smoke-filled operations room, marking the moment when an entire military philosophy was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the future of air combat no longer belonged to the fastest turners, but to the first watchers. In the months following the incident, the engagement became a quiet legend within the American naval aviation community, not because it showcased incredible daring or dramatic maneuvering, but because it demonstrated with absolute clarity how information dominance could reshape an air battle before either side exchanged a single turn. Top Gun instructors treated the tape as a rare and invaluable teaching artifact, emphasizing to new pilots that the future of air superiority would belong not to those who could pull the hardest G-forces, but to those who understood how to fuse sensors, timing, and tactical patience into a single decisive act. They replayed the engagement repeatedly, analyzing each phase to illustrate how the Tomcats' crew maintained discipline, even when two hostile fighters closed aggressively, trusting their radar and weapon systems to deliver the kill when the geometry aligned. For the Soviet advisors, however, the tape lingered in their memory as a haunting reminder of a doctrinal weakness they had long ignored, a flaw buried so deeply in their worldview that it took only 25 seconds to expose it completely. Many of them spent months drafting follow-up reports that attempted to reconcile the engagement with established theory, yet none of their explanations fully addressed the uncomfortable truth that their emphasis on maneuverability and close-range dominance had blinded them to the transformative power of sensor-driven warfare. As they saw their conclusions revised by higher command, they realized that the engagement had not merely been a tactical defeat. It had become a catalyst for a painful reassessment of the principles they had devoted their careers to defending. Meanwhile, Chinese officials, stung by the sudden loss of two fighters, began pressuring Soviet advisors to expedite training reforms and accelerate the introduction of more advanced radar systems, though progress remained inconsistent due to budget constraints and political hesitation. The incident sparked a quiet but influential debate within the Chinese Air Force about the necessity of moving beyond inherited doctrine and embracing a more technology-centric approach to air defense, a conversation that would eventually shape the direction of future modernization efforts. Even though few details of the engagement were released publicly, its impact reverberated through military circles as a warning about the dangers of underestimating technological evolution. Within American intelligence agencies, the 25-second kill served as confirmation that the United States had achieved a critical advantage in long-range identification and engagement, an advantage that could reshape strategic calculations across regions where Soviet-designed fighters still formed the backbone of local air defenses. Analysts highlighted the engagement in closed briefings, arguing that the Tomcats' performance demonstrated the viability of a broader shift toward platforms capable of leveraging sensor networks, data fusion, and high-precision weapons to neutralize threats before they entered visual range. They believed this incident represented not just a milestone for the F-14 program, but a glimpse into the future of modern aerial warfare, where victory would belong to those who acted first, rather than those who reacted best. As years passed, the story continued to circulate in classified circles, gaining a kind of reverence among those who understood how rare it was to witness a moment where the trajectory of military doctrine pivoted so sharply. The engagement became a symbolic dividing line between eras, marking the point where pilots and strategists alike were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that brute agility and aggressive tactics could no longer guarantee survival against opponents who wielded superior awareness and timing. And while the world eventually moved on, the lesson embedded in those 25 seconds endured. Dominance in the sky was no longer awarded to the aircraft that turned the tightest, but to the aircraft that saw the farthest, understood the earliest, and acted with the cold, unshakable confidence of warriors who trusted the invisible mathematics guiding their weapons. In the end, the legacy of that brief encounter remained etched not in the dramatic spectacle of aerial acrobatics, but in the quiet certainty with which a single F-14 erased two determined opponents, proving beyond any doubt that the future of air combat would belong to those who mastered the unseen dimensions of battle, where information, more than metal or muscle, determined who lived and who vanished into the empty sky.